the 1980s, what was social life like? What were your favourite things to do and what were your hobbies?
Oh, my favourite things to do in the 80s was really listening to music, watching a lot of TV, a lot of arts and crafts, things that were going on at that time. The music side of things started for me in the 1980s. I started performing with various groups, finding my talents and my skills as a singer, and being part of a group to see how far it would go. So that was a really exciting time for me, because it was the time of finding myself maturing from the teenager child coming into the adulthood, and it was very challenging but very enjoyable at the same time. The 80s were much more relaxing than now.
What TV shows and what music were you into in the 80s?
Oh, in the 80s, without giving away my age. I love things like Michael Jackson. He was Motown. It was those classics, Barry White, Luther Vandross, that sort of era of music. Then you had the pop music, Kate Bush and various different artists I was into at the time, Bay City Rollers, and that's coming out of the 80s, swinging slightly into the 90s. But it was that sort of music that was enjoyable there, a lot of pop music, disco music, that enhanced my vocal abilities to be interested, like Motown songs, Aretha Franklin, Jean Khan, Shaka Khan, Whitney Houston. You've got all the big ones there that we was trying to mimic their type of vocals and style of dressing, the big afros and the nice tight dresses, just stepping out there.
And what about TV?
On TV for me, the 80s, I think I was just tapping into my craftry and my creative side. So things like Blue Peter was like one of the main things that I watched, if I remember, in the 80s. And lots of arty craft work. They've got it now as art craft on the children's channel. So around that time, it was that sort of thing that I was watching. Obviously, I think EastEnders just started that time with early Pat Butcher and my fellow there, Ian. So I think around that time, the 80s was just, again, finding yourself, finding what you were capable of doing, what kind of activities was available, sports, and being part of the netball team and doing after school clubs as well, brownies and stuff like that. So around that time it was what was happening. So we just did what was available then. Yeah.
In the 1980s, what were your memories for the employment and the unemployment? How would you go about finding a job, and was it hard finding a job?
Right. Employment in the 80s, I would say it was a little bit challenging as it is today. Being that you had to have skills, you had to learn skills. They didn't have the opportunity where you have now, where you had grants that you could get, student loan grants. So it was a thing where your parents would have to find the money to put you through to schooling. There was one or two government funding if your parents was on a low income or receiving benefit money. So you would get like maybe a small help from social services, or what they call now concession, reduced on whatever was the course. So around that time, studying was the thing that I was into in that time, benefiting my skills. I went into secretarial work at that time, so I think it was, they called it clerical skills, which they have it now as PA or secretarial skills they had.
What were your memories in the 1980s about the riots? What impact and what was the aftermath about the riots?
Right. If we're going to specifically pinpoint a riot, such as maybe the Brixton riot at that time, I think it really did have an impact on me as an individual, seeing how black people as a whole, who was mainly involved in this riot, was affected by the deaths and the tragedies that was happening at that time. And I think they had to make a stand. It was a pity they called it a riot, because it didn't start off as a riot. It actually started off as a petition to get things better for the people who were involved in the massacre of the deaths at that time. So the riot really it made it more difficult after, but you do have to make a stand, you do have to put your foot down, you do have to have a say, and if it means you might have to riot, raise a storm to be noticed, then that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
That is great. Okay, back to your questions. Yeah, so what you're talking about the riot. So yeah, what impact do you think it had on the community? Did it change things, the riots?
I think not immediately, but the riot made a difference in terms of the people immediately affected. It made a change, but it didn't come immediately. The change came later when the news, the media got involved. You had students, you had parents, you had younger generations who were all affected by this massive riots. So I think it really helped the people in the immediate community, and today people are still talking about the riots, how it affected their life, what changes it had made to the direct environment. You know, the market people were affected, homes were affected, colleges, schools. So I think the riot really did make a difference. It wasn't just it wasn't unnecessary. It had a purpose for it to be done at that time.
What was the housing situation like in the 1980s, and how would you go about getting your own property?
Oh, well, to what I understood about the housing situation, I grew up in Berkshire, and I came to London, and fortunately the school that I went to was a Dr. Bernardo school, and they gave me what they call life skill training, where that they prepared you for going into your own flat, prepared you that you were going to get bills, they helped you with your budgeting. And so for me, it wasn't so difficult to have an accommodation at the time and have the ability to maintain that house up until today. But to what I understood, there was a long waiting list. You were prioritized with your circumstances, your health, how many children you had, if you was a single mother, you know, if you were suffering from mental illness or some sort of disability. So I think back then it was a little easier to get the property, but you was not getting a modern property. They would just give you somewhere where was shelter, somewhere to live. And maybe half of the time things weren't working, things were broken, and so it was uncomfortable. But the few people that I know, they went through the stages in the early 80s of going into a mother and baby home, and it was that direct route you had to promise you your own accommodation, your own flat to live. But now I'm not too sure how the system works. Very similar, but I think you have a grade from A to B, categorizing you where what you're entitled to, you know. So that's what I understand.
What was your first house like in London, or flat?
My first apartment flat was amazing, absolutely amazing. It was my own home. As I said, for me, it wasn't so challenging to be waiting on a long waiting list. When I first moved to London, I was in a bed and breakfast for a very short time, and then I was accommodated, maybe because of my background, coming from care home. They privatised me as needing somewhere to live, so I got that straightforward. But again, I did have to wait. But the other people that were living in the apartments where I was, obviously it wasn't that too much of a difficulty. You had about 8 different apartments there. People all had a similar sort of flats, either be a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom. So I don't think there was much problems in people having somewhere to live. The environment was a multicultural environment, which for me that was excellent, because my background, living amongst different nationalities and trying to get along with each other. So you would have an Asian family downstairs, you'd have chapati cooking, you'd smell everything, all the different smells and aromas. Then you had Chinese people who were doing another set of dishes. Then you'll have African people and West Indian people. So the community, the long and short was that community all came together, and you know, I think it was once a year or twice a year, especially around the bank holiday time, we'll all have like barbecue, and all of us be trying the different dishes. So it just depends, we just unified. For me, I remember the days going back just in the early 80s, they had a thing called a Jubilee, where it was a road function. everybody baked and cooked and did things to bring to this big picnic, and it was all beautifully decorated with, I suppose, the royal colours. And that was, at the time, it was Lady Diana and Prince Charles who was running things, and they were very popular at that time because they were young, fresh teenagers getting married, and I had a crush on Prince Charles like nobody's business. But I'm glad that he married Diana because I loved her as well, and she has two beautiful sons who live in her legacy. But going back to the Jubilees, that was the way of communities coming together. And I do miss those days. They don't have it so much now, that sort of like unions. But we have projects like what we're doing now, where I'm a designer, a tutor, and I'm bringing people together, taking them from their homes, letting them be involved with what the community's got to offer.
What was the communication like with the police with black people in the 1980s?
The communication with black people in the 1980s, I could be honest with you, it was a challenging experience. Back in the 80s, I think the police had less patience, less tolerance. There were a lot of the police enforcements that seemed to not be free or confident in their job. In terms of approaching how they approach black people. Again, maybe some of the youths that were being approached had a lot of personal issues of drugs, aggression, ignorance, a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge, lack of teaching from their own siblings how to conduct themselves. So there was a lot of peer pressure, unemployment, lack of education, and the police too, they were not sure how to address the community, and I suppose as they'd been trained to do a job, they stuck with the guidelines, but it wasn't pleasing to all black families who come from certain backgrounds, either with financial issues, communication issues, educational issues. So now I think the police are more trustworthy and they're more approachable and handle things with black people a little better than they did back then. There was a lot of racial issues going on with the police force which needed to be addressed, but I'm hoping in the 90s into this stage things are more changing. You would see more black officers or Asian officers, men of colour in the police force. Back then it was just one way police officer. It was mostly white Caucasian people that was in the police force that you would see or be noticed. So it was challenging for black people to feel confident to dress. Where my parents come from in Dominica, it's a Caribbean, so every other police officer is a black man, so it's easier to address. But here, a lot of the people found it back in the 80s quite difficult to feel confident to get the police involved with domestic issues or personal issues that was going on in their homes.
If you don't mind me asking, just because it's of interest, what was it like growing up in a care home and during that time?
Oh, for me, in a care home, apart from the emotional effects that you have not being with your siblings and family, for me it was a very good experience. The care home I went to, Dr. Bernardo's, the staff there were very caring, very loving, very expressive, wanted to know how you felt, gave you the support and encouragement, taught you things which I am now able to teach. Had I gone to a basic school anywhere else, and I've noticed from the schooling that I've seen with children growing up, they don't give you that secondary experience to tap into your creativity, tap into your abilities. In schools of today, they're just giving you the basic curriculum. You're getting maths, English, and so forth. But back then, in the boarding school I went to, because it was a stay-home environment, you were able to do a lot of things to pass the time while you were at home. So the house mothers that I lived with and the house fathers, they were really loving, very caring, and very sincere with me. And I had a wonderful experience doing so many things which I would not been able to have done with my parents, like horse riding, canoeing, sailing, camping. It was all of these areas of things which helped you to become who I am today, a confident entrepreneur.
That's amazing. And this is finally with this. I'm being cheeky, so say no if you want it. But would you sing for us? Would you?
What kind of song could I sing?
Something from the 80s would be amazing.
Something from the 80s. You name the song and I try and think. Who was in the 80s back then? You're talking
Whitney.
Whitney.
Are you saying Shaka Khan?
Okay. Always and forever, each moment with you is just like a dream to me that somehow came true. And I know tomorrow will still be the same. 'Cause we got a life of love that won't ever change. Yeah, join me. Every day, love me your own special way. Now that my heart awakes with a smile, take time to tell me you really care. And we'll spend tomorrow together. I'll always love you forever. Forever love you.
Yeah.